Let's move on and look at the third dimension, social cohesion, the tightness of our organization, how close we feel, the affinity we feel for each other. Now, a need to belong is recognized in Maslow's hierarchy of needs after physiological and safety concerns. So after we've taken care of shelter, do we have somewhere to live, food, do we have something to eat, our ability to reproduce, do we have someone to have babies with? Once we've taken care of those things, the next thing that we want out of life is a sense of belonging, right? We inherently want to be social. Human beings are social animals, right? We're not work from home hermits. And hence my prediction isn't that coming out the other side of the coronavirus crisis, the new normal is that everyone works from home. Human beings aren't designed that way. We're inherently social. We need to socialize. And I personally think that the office will become even more important, at least for small and medium-sized companies like ours. The second office in Bilbao that we're building about 2 blocks away from here in this direction. We had already planned to put in a full kitchen, but I'm now realizing that for staff who work from home some days of the week, some hours of the day, when they come to the office, it has to be a trusted environment. They might not be able to eat in restaurants because they're not trusted environments. If they're traveling on public transport, they can't trust whether other people on the bus or the train have the virus or not. So they're going to be coming through a very low trust environment from their house, trusted environment, to the office. It has to be a trusted environment. And therefore, we need to make it more like a home, and the workforce need to be more like a family. And consequently, we need to install things you wouldn't expect to have in an office traditionally. The full kitchen was already mildly eyebrow-raising here in Spain, in Bilbao. The idea that we'd build what the Basques call a choco. That was surprising to many people. And now we're putting in a shower. I'm going to put in a laundry, because if we need to regularly wash things in order to maintain the hygiene in our high-trust office, we need to be able to do everything that you might do at home. So I think offices are going to continue to be important because we're inherently social animals. The need to belong and conform often overrides logic or values and beliefs of an individual. Individuals often behave against a better judgment for fear of repercussions to their social status. Right? And what this leads to on a grand scale is things like groupthink errors. The failure of the Royal Bank of Scotland, for example, where the chairman had filled the executive committee with sycophants, none of whom would stand up to him for taking too much risk lending money during the first decade of the century. And consequently, the Royal Bank of Scotland, one of the oldest banks in the world, failed. The history of banking, the French invented the central bank, Bank of France first. The second central bank in the world, the Bank of Scotland, 1 year later, preceded the Bank of England by a year. The Bank of Scotland invented branch banking. And then about 20, 30 years later, they were accused or suspected of lending money to the rebellion. And the rebellion of, famous in British history with Bonnie Prince Charlie, or Charles III, as he would have been if he'd been crowned king. And the consequence was that the government couldn't shut down the Bank of Scotland. That was too difficult. Instead, they created the Royal Bank of Scotland as a rival, as a competitor, so that the Royal Bank of Scotland would not lend money to the rebellion. And therefore, we're talking about one of the world's oldest banks, and a senior executive who presumably wanted the fancy paychecks and bonuses, took too much risk, fucked the whole thing up. Right? Groupthink errors. In American politics, the Bay of Pigs is one of the great examples of this. You also get riots, ethnic cleansing, war crimes. How often is someone who's been involved in these activities, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and they say, oh, I was just following orders. You know, I knew it was wrong, but I was just following orders. Well, when people are put on trial for these things, that I was just following orders isn't a good enough excuse. Sometimes just following orders puts you on the wrong side of history. Now, at a more personal, social level, this behavior results in criminal behavior, vandalism, petty crime, drug taking, substance abuse. I imagine that most of you know that friend, that colleague, that parent who's had the call from the police station. Hi, we have your teenager. Please come to the police station. And the parent turns up at the police station to collect their kid. The police are trying to be softly. No charges are being made, at least for this first time. And the parent's like, I just don't understand it. That, you know, we're not a shoplifting family. We don't do vandalism. This is against our family values. And yes, of course it is. But actually, it's the peer group of the kid that matters more than their family. Children speak with the accent of the kids they hang out with. They don't speak with their parents' accent. Of course, they will if they're all from the same region. But if you're a foreigner, you move to a country, and your kid grows up, they don't speak with your accent. They speak with the accent of the other kids. Children are more influenced by their peer group than they are by their family and their parents. So this need to belong and the fear of being excommunicated, of being ostracized, drives a lot of behavior. A little bit of analysis on the two ends of the spectrum of social cohesion. A strong or tight, socially cohesive group, a clear definition of in and out. There's a clear and strict social hierarchy. There's usually a very strong rite of passage for entering the social group. There's formalized membership. In other words, you had to pass the test to become a member. Formalized progress up the social hierarchy. As I described with the constructs, pay grades, that's very formalized. You get a lot of loyalty. There's a strong sense of belonging. You can think of tightly knit social group as having like a very strong gravity, and it can pull people in. It's very sticky. They tend to have a deep hierarchy and allow progress in social status. It's not always the case, but it's commonly observed together that tightly knit groups have deep hierarchy because you have a lot of loyalty, and people need to see that their status and their recognition is progressing. But this is the opposite of what we'd expect in a high trust situation. So it's actually quite difficult to create high trust and high social cohesion. And businesses like Tupelo, they're quite unusual. We also see it in our Visotech case study, and to some extent in the Mobility case study. At big scale, this is hard to do, but perhaps the Virgin Group is an example of a large company that's high trust and tight social cohesion. We tend to drive for homogeneity and lack diversity because we've got this very strong idea of who we are, and that can get quite narrow. So they tend to be lower trust. It's hard to do both trust and tight social cohesion. Look to leadership only from the top, and tend to be conservative and risk averse because of this homogeneity. If you're doing something a bit liberal, a bit weird, are you really one of us? And the rules for coming in were so tight that you're really not allowed to break those rules. that the boundary around the group is very strong. So there tends to be excommunication for transgressing social norms and conventions, and tight, strong, cohesive groups tend to have very formalized processes for excommunicating and ostracizing people. And hence, they tend to be quite intolerant. It's very difficult to have strong social cohesion, have tolerance, have a liberal society and a high trust society. It's challenging, it's not impossible. So cults, highly cohesive social groups, cults, they make attractive homes for the lost. If an individual's a lost soul, if they feel that they're out of step with society, and then maybe that's giving them some depression, certainly anxiety, they've got some personal crisis. Individuals who are in personal crisis, and we've looked at that with our social psychology study in the earlier module, they are more likely to be attracted in to a tight-knit social group, a cult. Right? Lost sheep get sucked into cults. Highly cohesive social groups, they tend to be brittle and lack resilience, and therefore they're not robust because it's hard to be highly cohesive, anti-trust, and liberal. That the resilience comes from the trust and the liberal nature of the organization, and it's difficult to do that and be tightly knit. So the penguins and happy feet, inherently fragile, the Greenland Norse, inherently fragile, but in both cases, tightly cohesive social groups. Weak or loose social cohesion. There's a fuzzy definition of in and out. What does it really mean to be one of us or not? Who knows? Ambiguous social hierarchy, even if one or more leaders are clearly recognized. There's informal membership. Social status is determined by peers with no set evaluation criteria. There's no formal path for increasing your status, and therefore that creates anxiety, especially amongst the ambitious. And that anxiety can drive them into personal crisis. There's a lack of loyalty, there's a weaker sense of belonging, but we have tolerance of experimentation, much more innovative, tend to be a lot more liberal, and risk-taking because people have less to lose socially. Because of all this much weaker concept of the organization, the relationships, the structure of the social group, there's much less social risk from doing something different. Tend to be failure tolerance, there's a lot more diversity, and it's much easier to get leadership from any level. So weakening the social cohesion makes it easier to get this Kanban thing of leadership at any level, where tightly knit groups will tend to see people looking to someone else for leadership, and therefore that's causing delay. However, we prefer tight-knit groups for change because if we can flip the leader, if we can persuade the leader that the change is a good idea, the whole group comes along together. But with a weak or loose socially cohesive group, we have to persuade all the individuals individually that the change is a good idea, because they're not such a tight herd. They don't all follow each other in the same way. They will to some extent, but not in the same way that a tight-knit group will. So consequently, driving change in a loosely cohesive social group, even though they might be liberal with a lot of diversity, they're willing to take risks, the problem is they all want to take risks in different directions. They all want to be liberal in different ways, a much more individualistic type of society. And of course, individualism is a lower maturity behavior over here, and lower trust. So what you should realize from these three sections is that these three dimensions, they're not completely independent levers. You move one, it will affect the other two, and to get all three of them at the top is very challenging from a leadership perspective, from a culture hacking perspective. All right, so learning to understand the sociological context in order to make an accurate assessment is a critical skill that if you're wanting to drive change, you want to be able to innovate, create new ideas in the organization to overcome resistance. And that resistance is complex because you're dealing with these groups of human beings. The human beings are complex. You put them in a group, the complexity's going up exponentially. You need to get good at assessing this social context, the social innovation, the social capital, and the social cohesion in order to be able to lead change effectively. But recognize that that culture and that sociology, it's not a given, it's not a fixed thing. It's something that you can change, you can manipulate, you can affect with the actions you take.